Tonight we have Gabe Neville, who is here to talk about a subject about the 8th Virginia Regiment. And we know that the 8th Virginia included a lot of Shenandoah County boys, and that's who Peter Muhlenberg was getting his troops together, and that's where he began, right in Woodstock, to get them together. Gabe lives in Fairfax County. He's a business consultant, so he actually has a day job. I bet that really gets in the way of all your history stuff.
It's so annoying.
Yeah. But he said that the bicentennial is really what sparked his interest in the Revolutionary War. And then he dug down into the 8th Virginia. And boy, there seems to be a lot of material there in the 8th Virginia, which is wonderful. So tonight, he's going to talk about Shenandoah County Patriots not named Muhlenberg. So, Gabe?
Thank you, Barbara. Do we want this on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that right, Hank?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Is that better?
Not good.
Okay. So thank you all. This is a real pleasure for me to get to come talk to you about my favorite subject. As Barbara sort of intimated, it started as a passing interest, and then it became a hobby, and then it became sort of an obsession, and now I'm writing a book and I have a website. So it's getting worse and worse all the time. The one story, though, is that I had a particular interest in the 8th Virginia Regiment because I have an ancestor from Pittsburgh who was in it. And I went to, it's now closed, but it was called the David Library of the American Revolution near Washington's Crossing in Pennsylvania. And if there was anywhere to find information, it was there. So I went in and I spent 2 hours. I told the librarian what I was doing. And then they were closing and I was getting ready to leave. And the library, this is 1997, I think. And the librarian says, so how'd you make out? And I said, well, there doesn't seem to be anything here. Or I think I said, there doesn't seem to be anything out there. And he said, oh, there's a lot. You just have to find it. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So Barbara asked me for some ideas on topics, and I suggested this one amongst a couple others. She liked the notion that we're not going to talk about Peter Muhlenberg, because I know that's all you people talk about in this county every day, right? So I'm going to try not to even say Muhlenberg, but it'll probably slip out a couple of times. Okay, so I have to click 2 buttons here. So this is just where you can learn more. I have a website. That's the thing you really ought to check out. If you are on Facebook, first of all, shame on you. Number 2, I post to it every day. So, and there are a few videos on YouTube that you might find interesting, including one that I might remind you about before the end of the evening. So just a little bit of background history about the county that most of you know. It used to be part of Frederick County, right? And the way it went in colonial times, when there was an official state church, what we now call the Episcopal Church, they would create a new parish, usually before they created the new county. So Beckford Parish was created in 1769 or 1770, and James Wood, who was on the vestry for Frederick County, was traveling and met with Henry Muhlenberg up in Pennsylvania. I can say that last name because it's a different Muhlenberg. And said, we really need a rector for our new parish, but everybody's German, or most people are German, and it sure would be nice if we could sort of work something out. And that's how the person whose name I'm not going to say tonight got here. But he wasn't an Anglican, so he wasn't legally allowed to be the rector. So he had to travel to London, become a deacon, and then I think the next day become a priest, and then sail back. And that's how he got here in 1772. He's only here for 5 years, because in 76 he became a colonel and rode off and rarely came back, and then moved back to Pennsylvania. So I'm going to tell you about some guys who were born here, raised here, and died here, who maybe deserve a little more attention. So here's one who was not born here. So Jonathan Clark, he was from Caroline County when Dunmore County, which is now Shenandoah County, you know that piece of history, I'm sure, when it was created in 1772, They wanted to bring some people from Tidewater and Piedmont, in other words, English people here to sort of run things, to show the Germans and the Scotch-Irish how things were done in Virginia, right? So he got a job not as the county clerk, but as the deputy county clerk under Thomas Marshall from Fauquier County. What that meant is that Marshall got 2/3 of the money and Clark did all the work. I think that's literally true. But Clark became a big deal. He was a delegate to the Virginia Convention. He became a captain in the Dunmore Independent Volunteer Company, which was a big deal I'll explain more about. And then a captain in the 8th Virginia Regiment, among other things. I have a lot to tell you, so I'm going to either talk fast or go over. Barbara said to talk fast, so I'm going to try to do that. We got a disagreement. So this is just a road sign marker from Caroline County. This is where Jonathan Clark grew up, along with his brothers. Spoiler alert, one of them is William Clark, as in Lewis and Clark, right? Another brother was George Rogers Clark, by far the most important general on the western front of the war, which people don't pay much attention to. So that's that. The great thing about Jonathan Clark is he kept a diary every single day in which he wrote almost nothing. It's incredibly annoying. I mean, this is what it looks like. I mean, you can see how many days he just wrote clear. That's the weather, right? Just clear day, right? After the Battle of Brandywine, he wrote like 3 sentences, right? But it's still very, very valuable because there are days when he's out fishing with Peter Muhlenberg, right? Or the Committee of Safety met, right? Or just he was in Williamsburg, right? So it's very, very helpful to trace the history of what's going on here, but also with the 8th Virginia Regiment, which he played a big role in. A few of the entries are, for instance, May 26, 1772. It says clear at Ditto. That's reference to where he slept that night. A court held for Dunmore County and the first ever held for said county. Pretty cool, huh? And then the next one, a year and a half later, clear at the Three Springs. Does anybody know what the Three Springs is? I have no idea.
I don't know.
Yeah, I just thought somebody might know. How do you say it? Is it Sevier? Sevier? Does anybody? Sevier. John Sevier and family set off for Holston. They moved to Tennessee. And we're going to talk about him some more. On the 30th of 1774, clear a hunting with the Reverend Peter Muhlenberg. I can't read the whole thing. And since I have to talk fast, I won't try to. And then March 23rd, 1775, clear at Richmond. The convention continued, lay at Captain Gwynn's. That is the day at the Second Virginia Convention when Patrick Henry gave his speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." Jonathan Clark was there and heard it.
But he didn't say anything about it.
No, he never says anything about anything. That's incredibly frustrating. So then just a couple more. The powder alarm, if you know your Virginia history, like every Virginian should, the local volunteer company, which I think he was the captain of, set off to get the gunpowder back, but then they came back. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. That's the entry on that. He was in Charleston, South Carolina, when news arrived of the Declaration of Independence. And then here's the 2 or 3 sentence description of the Battle of Brandywine I told you about. So it's just great stuff. This is just a little map of what the frontier looked like. Rivers and roads were both important for transportation. You're going to probably yell at me a few times for this. Okay. This is a map of what the Western Virginia looked like. Truth be told, the Shenandoah Valley was no longer the frontier when the revolution happened. It was sort of Dad's frontier, right? But most people had experience on the frontier fighting with Indians. They were good with a rifle. A lot of the things you hear about the frontier were true of the Shenandoah Valley, but the true frontier was further out in Hampshire County, That giant blob there in the bottom left, that's the state of Kentucky and more, then known as Fincastle County. We're up near Pittsburgh, which Virginia still claimed at that time. So that's that. Okay, so John Sevier. He was born in what is now Rockingham County, but I think a stone's throw from the county line. I gather he is given credit as the founder of Newmarket. And as we saw in Jonathan Clark's diary, he moved to Holston in 1773. Holston is a river that you saw a piece of in that last map that runs down into what was then North Carolina and is now Tennessee. And a bunch of Virginians settled there. They thought it was Virginia. They wanted it to be Virginia. And they organized themselves as the Watauga Association, and then later as the Washington District when the war began. So John Sevier was down there for a lot of that. He fought in the 1776 Cherokee War, which I don't have time to explain to you. He was at the Battle of Kings Mountain as an important player, and in a later Cherokee War as well. More to be said about John Sevier in a bit, but here is a picture from an old Tennessee history book. That is him reaching over the wall, rescuing a woman after the gates to the fort have been locked, and she's trapped out there about to get captured by Indians, and he helps her over the wall. If I remember right, they got married. It's very, very romantic. Okay, Richard Campbell. So he, I think, is from here. I don't know if he was born here. If he was born when it says he was born, he would have been here before some of the earliest settlers. So he likely was born somewhere a little bit further out in the Piedmont or somewhere. But his childhood is not documented well. I have a theory, but we'll skip over that. He was a deputy sheriff when the county was organized and then reappointed. When Jonathan Clark moved here from Caroline, he rented a room from Richard Campbell. He was a member of the Dunmore Independent Volunteer Company, which responded to the powder alarm. And then he was a captain of the English Company of the 8th Virginia. I will explain more about that in a bit. And then he got promoted and promoted. Abraham Bowman is somebody you have no doubt heard of. Here are two markers from within the county. Very important family locally. His grandfather was Yost Height, who brought the first large group of Germans to settle here. This is a house in Pennsylvania, actually close to where I grew up. If you look at the first three windows on the right, that is, including the front door on the first floor, that is the original house. This was Yost Height's house in Pennsylvania. Before he sold it in 1730, I think, and took the Great Wagon Road, known to you all as Route 11, known to us in Pennsylvania as Route 30, and settled here. The house is still there. It was later owned by Samuel Pennypacker, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, and he built a big addition to it, put the dormers on the roof, the wraparound porch, and it's now a state historic site. So Yost Height was Abraham Bowman's grandfather. They moved here and settled along Cedar Creek. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong buttons. I just think Cedar Creek's pretty, so I give you a picture. His dad built a mill, and that is why we have Bowman's Mill Road out there. The house, some of you have been inside this house. When I found out it was possible to go inside, I made a beeline out here to go inside. It's who's been in there? Isn't it amazing? I mean, it hasn't changed in 200 years. Everything's still there, except there's new wires now, but that's it. That house is a treasure, and I hope some millionaire drops a bunch of money on it to fix it up, because it needs it. But that was their home. There were a bunch of kids, I think 13, but 4 of the brothers were very notable in the Revolution. All grew up here in Shenandoah County. And they all moved to Kentucky. This will be a theme in my speech. Everybody moved away, right? Abraham, John, Joseph, Isaac were all very important in different ways in the Revolutionary War. And this is a memorial plaque for them in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Kind of a neat thing. They were known as the 4 Centaurs because they were such great horsemen.
You'll get to it later on, but why did they all move west?
Everybody moved west back then. but I think especially anybody who was in, I'm going to call it Dunmore County back then. I mean, Route 11 was like the Oregon Trail, right? I mean, people were out here because they were on the move. And of course, serving in the Continental Army, you were constantly on the move. Soldiers, Virginians were rewarded with land in the West because the government didn't have any money, but it had lots of land, right? So they got land out west. So lots of different reasons. Taverner Beale is somebody I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight. Is that a name anybody knows? I'm just curious. Okay. So he was the proprietor of Mount Airy. You all have probably seen this post by the side of the road. That was his estate. He was from Orange County. He was an original member of the county court. I'm going to talk a little bit about county government in a minute. He was a member of the vestry. He was the sheriff, the original sheriff, so Richard Campbell's boss. Also a member of the Dunmore Independent Company, and then an officer in the 8th Virginia. Okay, so county government back then, a lot of us don't understand it because it doesn't follow the logic that we have now. The primary point being separation of powers. They didn't believe in that back then, right? So you could be a member of the court and the executive and the legislature all at the same time. And it frequently happened, and the military. So the way counties were governed, it was really an oligarchy, right? You had a bunch of men, and they were of course all men, who were the leading citizens, and they just ran everything. If there was a local dispute, you went to them. If there were roads that needed to be built, you went to them. They did everything. They were appointed by the governor, but they were there until they were removed, and not by popular vote. So these are the members of the original county court. They were appointed by what was called a commission of the peace. So sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the commissioners, or justices, magistrates. All means the same thing. They were members of the county court. Some of these names won't mean a whole lot to you, but most of them became locally, if not nationally, important in revolutionary affairs. The sheriff had to be a member of the county court, appointed by the court. Well, that's too much detail. And I've talked about the rest of these guys. Many of these names you'll hear me talk about some more. Here's the original vestry. Not 100% certain that the list is accurate. It's based on a letter, and it doesn't say that they're the vestry, but they seem to be the vestry. Again, you'll see Taverner Beale's name again, Burr Harrison's name again. Many of these guys played important revolutionary roles.
All those names are still in our phone book.
I bet they are.
Ninth generation, yeah.
I bet they are, yeah. Proud heritages. Here's the militia. So the militia, again, often the same names. You had a county lieutenant, and he was the boss. And he carried the title of colonel, but he wasn't actually a soldier, although he could be. And then you had field officers, colonel, lieutenant colonel, and major, and then neighborhood captains. Every man was a member of the militia. But it was like a ready reserve. And if there was something that happened, you literally you had to muster, and then people would literally step forward to volunteer. And if there weren't enough of them, then they would draft. But you had neighborhood captains, and there's at least some of them. Okay, so when the Boston Port Act happened, and Boston was blockaded, all of the colonies responded because they all knew they could be next. And in Virginia, the first Virginia Convention met, and they sent their delegates back home to get gauge the mood of the people at home. And then they were going to reconvene and decide what to do. So what this turned into is they all went home to their respective counties, and they had a town meeting, and they almost all produced these resolutions or resolves where they declared that their rights were being trampled on, that they were going to defend their rights, that they were still loyal to the king as long as he was loyal to them, right? Some of the language is very cute. And this is a Virginia Gazette report on the Dunmore County resolves. And you'll notice that about little more than halfway through, it'll say a committee of the following gentlemen, the Reverend Peter Muhlenberg, Francis Slaughter, Abraham Bird, Taverner Beale, John Tipton, and Abraham Bowman were appointed to draw up resolves suitable to the same occasion. I would love to read the document to you, but it'll take too much time. Every kid in this county should read it in 5th grade or 6th grade. It's a very cool thing. Those same names, I assume, became members of the county committee. And I know that Peter Muhlenberg was the chairman of the county committee. We usually refer to these committees as the Committee of Safety. They didn't really call themselves that. This Committee of Safety was in Williamsburg. This was a shadow government. We were not at war yet. We were not in a state of rebellion yet. Nobody was shooting yet. But they didn't like the governor, and the governor had dismissed the House of Burgesses. So the Virginia Convention was sort of a shadow House of Burgesses, and the county committee was sort of a shadow county court. And you also had a shadow militia. They didn't call themselves that. That's just how I explain it. These were gentlemen volunteers, right? Who would essentially, they were going to enforce what the county committee had to say. And the county committee, after the second convention, they were enforcing what was called the Virginia Association, which was a boycott of British goods, import and export, right? So if somebody showed up in Woodstock selling tea, they got in big trouble. And there actually is a document of a guy trying to do that. It's a pretty neat thing. And these guys were the enforcers. Jonathan Clark was the captain, and these are the guys that rode off towards Williamsburg when news came of the powder alarm to get the gunpowder back. Here's Governor Dunmore, the bad guy. Here's the powder magazine in Williamsburg. You've probably all seen it. What's that? Oh, I am so sorry. Here's the militia guys. You've seen almost all those names already. And there are probably people living here with most of those names still. I'll pause on that. Barbara, keep me honest on the clicker, will you? All right. There's the governor, Lord Dunmore. You can tell he was Scottish, can't you? Yeah. There's the powder magazine in Williamsburg. He had some Royal Marines sneak the gunpowder out in the middle of the night. Same thing that happened in Lexington and Concord, by the way. They just didn't start shooting here. They almost did. So when the Dunmore militia, or Dunmore volunteers, excuse me, marched off to get the gunpowder back, they found out halfway there that it had been resolved. So they turned around and went to Lawrence Snapp's house and had a barbecue instead. Okay. Now Lawrence Snapp in the Clark Diary says lived in Tom's Brook. This is another Snapp house. You all know this house. I assume there's some relation, but it's not in the right spot. It's just a great house. Okay, so this is a letter from a Tory. It is not signed, but he was, well, I'll just read it to you. Gentlemen, and this is to the Dunmore Committee of Safety, right here, right? Gentlemen, I have this moment received a summons to appear before your grand tribunal, which, considering my duty to my sovereign, I cannot comply with. For you gentlemen, permit me to tell you that so long as you remain refractory and yield no submission to the mandates of the king, I shall pay no obedience to the summons of an illegal assembly combined in the most unjustifiable manner and under their consideration the most treasonable proceedings. Therefore, you have my free consent to make whatever conjectures you think proper with regard to my conduct, and I assure you I feel with the most perfect indifference what they are or the consequences of them. Isn't that great? So there is a record of a guy getting ducked. Does anybody know what ducked is? It's a ducking stool? Yes. I think it's this guy, where they would probably down in the river, They had a long beam. On one end there was a chair. You were tied to the chair, and they would, like a lever, they would duck you in the water and then raise you back up, and you would be yelling mad, and then they'd do it again, come back up, you'd be yelling mad, and they did it until you stopped yelling, right? That was the punishment for Tories. We know they did it at least once here in Dunmore County. This guy, William Clark, not related to Jonathan, he was forced to sign this. I, William Clark, by the way, the signature and the rest of it are not the same handwriting. I, William Clark of said county of Dunmore, do hereby declare on the holy evangelist of Almighty God that henceforth I will not either publicly or privately hold any correspondence with any person whatsoever who shall speak disrespectfully of the Continental Congress or any committee of any county or their proceedings, and I hereby declare that the Americans are justly entitled to those privileges for which they are contending, and further that I will depart from the town of Woodstock within 10 minutes from this time, and from the county of Dunmore before tomorrow night, and not return therein for the space of 1 year. About a year later, there's a guy with the same name enlisted in the 8th Virginia Regiment. How many William Clarks are there around? I'd love to know. Here is another letter, and this is from a member of the county committee. It's long enough, I'm not going to read the whole thing for the sake of time, but he has just, I'll read just a little bit. I've just returned from Frederick Court, so he's back from Winchester. It is believed that the governor has passed his word about the gunpowder and honor in an ambiguous manner for the returning of the ammunition as it is thought he has fixed no time. He promised to give back the gunpowder, but he didn't say when, right? And then he gives a report that a ship has just arrived from England, and there's a report from that ship that there are a bunch of redcoats on the way, right? And they are going to give an account that before that date, 20 men of war and 95 transports made sail for this continent with orders to block up every port except New York and Quebec. If it is so, there will be bloody breaches, he says. Which I think is fun. So this is, you've been to Williamsburg and you know the Capitol. The reconstructed Capitol is the old one that burned in 1749. This is the Capitol that existed during the Revolution. You already know that Jonathan Clark was a delegate. So was Peter Muhlenberg for the second, third, and fourth conventions. At the fourth one, they decided to create, this is after the news had come of Lexington and Concord, they decided that they were going to raise an additional 6 regiments. They already had 2. And somebody had the great idea, that somebody might have been Peter Muhlenberg. You know, we got all these Germans out in the Shenandoah Valley. If they just had the right leadership, they might sign up. So they decided to create a German regiment. And lo and behold, here are the 3 field officers. Peter Muhlenberg from Woodstock, Abraham Bowman from Strasbourg, and Peter Helfenstein from Winchester. Sorry, nobody from Edinburg. And that was going to be the German regiment. In actuality, I bet maybe a third of the soldiers were German. Probably more were Scotch-Irish. And most of the company officers were English or something else. This is a map of where the regiment comes from. I know most of the history that we hear about Peter Muhlenberg suggests that the entire regiment was raised, in Woodstock. Just not true. It was raised all those colored counties. So Pittsburgh, 2 companies. Where it says Fincastle County, so that's like Wytheville, right? Abingdon, 1 company. Culpeper 1, Dunmore 2, Frederick, Berkeley, Hampshire, and Augusta. 10 companies, each with 68 enlisted guys, a captain, 2 lieutenants, an ensign, a drummer, a fifer, 4 sergeants. Since we're not talking about Peter Muhlenberg today, the whole thing with the cloak, I think the story's true, but I don't think he was hiding his uniform. He was giving a sermon, he was wearing it as a matter of propriety. That's my theory anyway. This is a note in the papers of the local committee of safety. It's just amazing that we have those. They're in Richmond. This is a record from the Dunmore Committee appointing Jonathan Clark, captain of the German company, and Richard Campbell, captain of the English company. Dunmore had to raise two companies, and they decided to do it that way. If you look at the names of the people in the companies, I'm not sure it really worked out that way. But it's hard to tell sometimes because German names got anglicized when they were written down. But there's a Height, Matthias Height. Height's a famous name. The guy at the bottom, Leonard Cooper, I'm going to have more to say about him later. Jacob Rinker is a name I'll say more about. This is a little bit easier for you to read. So the English company was Richard Campbell, Matthias Height. By the way, Matthias wasn't very popular. Campbell, Height, Second Lieutenant John Steed, Ensign and Lieutenant Cooper, and then they had a cadet who was like a 14-year-old kid who was learning how to be an officer, right? I'm just guessing on the age, but usually a real young guy, William Dennis. And then the German company was Jonathan Clark, Jacob Rinker from Connexville, Adam Darling, who quit, and then Taverner Beale and Jacob Parrott. So those are Dunmore's, or Shenandoah County's, two companies. A little bit about Jacob Rinker. I used to think that was the house he lived in, but I guess it's actually, they called it the meeting house, and his house was just up the street. He was Swiss. The house he lived in was built by his father, so he was born here probably. He was famous as a surveyor. I keep doing this. This is an actual survey by him that's down in the museum in Luray. It's kind of cool. There are some attestations that his surveys were remarkably accurate. I guess he was Swiss, right? So you'd expect that. So they marched off to war, and this is where they went first. That's the James River. This map is from about the time of the Battle of Yorktown, so you see all the activity up top. Where they were is down in the bottom left corner. You probably can't read it, but that's Suffolk. That's where the 8th Virginia Rendezvous was. That's where the different companies congregated. And their first job was unpleasant. They were to stop Tories from supplying Lord Dunmore, who was on a ship, and preventing slaves from escaping to join Dunmore. When they got there, okay, this is just an unbelievable treasure. A woman just emailed me and said she has a letter. This is from a young enlisted guy from Dunmore County, German, who deserted, but was captured and taken back. This is a letter home to his parents from Suffolk. It's just an unbelievable thing. So, but first look at top where it says, he addressed it to his father. Fast an der narrow Biesen, Tri Mile von Woodstock in Dunmore. I mean, it's a little bit familiar. That translates to close to the narrow passage creek, 3 miles from Woodstock in Dunmore. I'm not sure it's exactly German or exactly English. And what he says to his parents is, God greets you, father and mother, brothers and sisters. I hope this letter will find you all healthy, and I am also healthy, and God be thanked 1,000-fold, and we are in Suffolk. And because of the war, I have, most unusually for me, written you a letter. And when you can, send me a letter on down as quickly as you can. And we were 3 weeks and 2 days on the journey. So much from me. Isn't that nice? So what happened then is Major General Charles Lee showed up in Virginia. The British were headed to Charleston. So he grabbed the 8th Virginia to go down and rescue Charleston. The 8th Virginia at the time was technically a provincial regiment. They were not in the Continental Army, which means they were not supposed to go out of the colony. And it was still a colony, right? So a bunch of guys said, this is not what I signed up for, and they deserted. Some of them used that as an excuse. Heinrich was one of them. And here is a letter from John Clark, who's Jonathan Clark's little brother, who became the deputy county clerk after Jonathan became an officer, explaining the whole story. I won't read it because I'm going to be over already. So in Charleston, they fought at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, often known as Fort Moultrie, but they were not in the fort. They were on the opposite end of the island, blocking an amphibious crossing from what is now called Isle of Palms, where those houses are. That was their first real battle. Then they congregated under the Liberty Tree outside of Charleston for the first reading of the Declaration of Independence. And he notes that very briefly, Jonathan Clark does in his diary. Then they marched down to Georgia. They were going to attack Florida, but they all got malaria, and a large number of them died, and almost everybody was extremely sick. This is a letter from Abraham Bowman. It's in the archives in Philadelphia. He's been asked to provide some boats to block do something against the enemy. And he writes back, "It is with reluctance I inform you that was there more armed vessels here, it would not be in our power to man them, as almost all our men are sick and unfit for duty." When I say sick, I mean very sick. That is October 31st, 1776, Sunbury, Georgia. Okay, so John Clark, I mentioned him. When they hobbled back home after their adventure in the South, a bunch of guys were dead. A bunch of guys had deserted. Some officers resigned, which they could do. So John Clark, Jonathan's little brother, signed on as a junior officer, actually in a new company. There are no pictures of Jonathan or John, so I've put family members. The earlier slide of Jonathan had his two brothers. Here are their two sisters. So John became an officer in a new company. And the Virginia raised another regiment, the 12th Virginia, which raised another company from Dunmore County. The captain of it was Jonathan Langdon. The colonel of the 12th was James Wood, the guy who hired Peter Muhlenberg to be the rector. And this guy, Abraham Tipton, he was the son of John Tipton, who was a member of the Dunmore Committee. The 8th and the 12th were in the same brigade in 1777 and 1778. So they coordinated very closely. They were at the Battle of Brandywine. Unfortunately, and then they were at Germantown. Unfortunately, John Clark in his very first battle got captured and got tuberculosis. He made it home, but he died in 1783. Sad story. They were at Valley Forge. This shows you, this is a map that was discovered in Rhode Island recently. That is what they call Mount Joy at Valley Forge. Down at it's hard to read, but at the very bottom it says B.G. Scott. That's Brigadier General Charles Scott. It's his brigades, so the 8th and the 12th are encamped there. And then the writing that is curved there says Marquis de Lafayette's division. They had been under Adam Stevens' division from Martinsburg, but he was kicked out of the army after Germantown for being a drunk. And they don't talk about that a lot up there, but it's true. So Lafayette took over the division.
What, at age 24 or something?
Younger than that. I think he was 20. Yeah. This is 10 years old, but those are my boys, looking as ferocious as I could get them to look, pointing at a marker at Valley Forge, which is the spot I just showed you. In fact, they're pointing, you might be able to make it out here, they're pointing at where it says the 8th Virginia Regiment with Abraham Bowman. Right under that, it says the 12th Virginia Regiment. At Valley Forge, the guys who had enlisted in 1776 for 2 years got discharged. but you had to stay through that tough winter. If you re-enlisted, you got to go home on furlough, right? If you were, you get the inducement there, right? But there were only about 50 original enlistees left when they got to Valley Forge, healthy enough to sort of serve and stand on their feet. Out of 680, assuming every company was full, there would have been 680 privates when the regiment was first formed. For various reasons, they were down to maybe 55 healthy original guys. That's how tough their service was. But that also includes 80-some deserters, et cetera. So now they're down to maybe a regiment of maybe 150 men, including new enlistments. It was too small to be a real regiment, so the 4th Regiment, the 8th Regiment, and the 12th Regiment were combined into what they call the 4th, 8th, 12th Regiment. And that's how they fought at the Battle of Monmouth. And then in September of 78, they consolidated the line. The 8th was folded into the 4th, and the 12th became the new 8th Virginia Regiment, which causes confusion for people, especially people doing genealogy. But that's the end of the 8th Virginia as its own unit. Abraham Bowman lost his job as a consequence because his regiment didn't exist anymore. So he went came back home and he went to the governor, Patrick Henry, and said, hey, you know, I'm still a patriot. Can you give me a job? You know, I'd love to serve somehow. And Patrick Henry said, yeah, we don't really have anything for you, sorry. So Abraham Bowman was out of work. But other soldiers stayed in, including Jonathan Clark, who got promoted and became a major. And in 1779, there was a small battle of Paulus Hook. So this is in New York. That's New York City in the distance. They staged sort of a midnight raid with Light Horse Harry Lee. It was Lee's idea. And they captured a bunch of guys and made it back to camp, and they're all heroes. But there was controversy. Here is a gold medal, one of like 6 or 7 that Congress gave to officers for heroism. It went to Light Horse Harry Lee. But do you know who the senior officer in the battle was? Jonathan Clark. So there was a court-martial. A bunch of officers got very angry about this, and they had a court-martial, and that's Paulus Hook today, by the way. Jonathan Clark was very gracious about it. The raid had been Light Horse Harry Lee's idea, and even though Clark outranked him, he wasn't going to make a stink about it, and so, you know, it was fine. But that's part of the reason you hear Light Horse Harry Lee's name all the time, and not Jonathan Clark's. You know, Light Horse Harry Lee was Robert E. Lee's dad, right? Okay, Leonard Cooper, I told you about him earlier, just mentioned his name. They're now up outside of New York. That's not him, it's just a picture of a duel. He started as an ensign, he's now a captain. And a senior captain named Abraham Kirkpatrick in the regiment, or originally in the regiment, from Pittsburgh, kind of a mean guy, badgers him into a duel after like hitting him with a stick or something, you know, wounding his honor. But Cooper doesn't want to fight. He just, you know, it's fine, whatever, I don't want to fight this guy. But all the officers say, like, if you won't stand up for your honor, we won't serve with you any longer. Honor was a big deal back then. So Cooper does what he has to and challenges Kirkpatrick to a duel. Kirkpatrick shoots him. He gets his leg amputated. Can't serve anymore. Serves out the war in what was called the Invalid Regiment, where they would just sort of sit in camp and do simple tasks. And was actually one of the very last soldiers discharged from the Continental Army. And because there were only a handful left, George Washington signed his discharge personally, which is a cool thing. Okay, so others went south. That is Nathaniel Greene. Without a doubt, in my mind, George Washington's best general. But I can't get into that tonight. Almost the entire Virginia line was captured when Charleston surrendered on May 12th, 1780. and then there were a couple of other battles that didn't go well, and Washington finally sent his best general down, Nathaniel Greene, and at the Battle of Cowpens, which most of you know about, Greene divided his army, which was against all military doctrine, and sent Daniel Morgan to fight Cowpens while he kept the other half of his army back. Jacob Rinker from out here in Conicksville was in the part that didn't go to Cowpens. But after that battle, he brought all the prisoners back up here. It's kind of neat. Then at Guilford Courthouse, Greene fought what are sometimes called like the four Pyrrhic victories. He fought 4 battles, lost all of them, but British casualties were so high that they couldn't control the Carolinas anymore at the end. And Guilford Courthouse was the first of those. Philip Huffman, a name that you saw early on, he was killed there. At the Battle of Eutaw Springs, the last of those 4 battles, Richard Campbell, remember, deputy sheriff, member of the volunteer brigade or company, captain and then major. He's now a lieutenant colonel who had asked for a transfer so he could be in the heat of the action, directly from George Washington. He's killed at Eutaw Springs. His son was next to him, like a little kid. He is the highest ranking officer from Virginia who died in combat in the Revolution, after only Hugh Mercer. And that is, if you look sort of to the right, you see a guy slumping over his horse. That's him. This is an Alonzo Chapel painting from, I don't know when, 100 years ago. That is Light Horse Harry Lee with Richard Campbell as Richard Campbell is dying on his horse. And that's probably Nathaniel Greene waving his hat up there. So then Yorktown happens right after Eutaw Springs, which is why we never hear about Eutaw Springs. But the war is not over, particularly out west. John Bowman, older brother of Abraham, from here, he is a very important guy out on the frontier. He was the county lieutenant of Kentucky County. Yes, that was a county. And fought valiantly on the western frontier in a number of ways. This, I think, was his home. I can tell you more afterwards about why I think so. It's been moved. But he established what was called Bowman Station near Bergen, Kentucky. And Abraham Bowman, you remember Patrick Henry didn't have a job for him? He then moved out west too and lived here for a few years. This is the way they would do this is they would build one section of the cabin, and then when they had time, they would build another one with sort of a breezeway in between. And then later, they would put siding on it, and it would look like a big, respectable house. This was John Bowman's house in Kentucky, and probably where I think it was 30 families Abraham brought from the Shenandoah Valley out to settle in Kentucky in the winter of 79-80. These are a couple of pictures from inside. These pictures date from 1980 when the house was dismantled and moved. This, however, is still there. This is Abraham Bowman's cabin. The other one was John Bowman's cabin. This is Abraham Bowman's cabin just outside of Lexington. After he lived with John for a couple years, John died in 1784. Abraham built this just outside of Lexington. I went to see it. There were old pictures of it looking terrible, like it was about to collapse. And I figured out where it was, and I sent a blind email to the property owner, and I got permission to go look at it. So when I get there, it's one of these giant horse farms outside of Lexington where they have the electronic gate, that opens up with the guard post and all that stuff. Do you know who owns this farm? The Emir of Dubai, right? So and he threw some pocket change at restoring the cabin. Pocket change, probably hundreds of thousands, I don't know. But it looks great, and it's very unusual. It has a basement, which log cabins never have. It has a second floor, which actually makes it a log house, not a cabin, and an exterior staircase. It's a neat building. Abraham was in the Battle of Blue Licks, which if you ask a Kentuckian was the last battle of the Revolution. And his name is on this monument. Local boy. Okay, others went not to Kentucky, but down to Tennessee. I'm looking to see what time it is. A little bit over. John Tipton, who you saw in several different capacities on the early slides, he moved to Tennessee. I won't read through all of this stuff, but you might know, or you might not know, that Watauga settlement that I told you about earlier along the Holston, they thought they were Virginians, and then they found out that they were in North Carolina, which they didn't really like. And then North Carolina, after the war, ceded the territory to Congress and then changed their mind. Right? So when all of this confusion was going on, they decided, you know what, we're just going to create a state, and we're going to name it after Ben Franklin. Right? So it was the state of Franklin, and it had a state legislature and counties. It had everything. But Tipton was loyal to North Carolina and said we shouldn't be doing this. This is secession, or whatever. But John Sevier, who had also moved down there, he was all for Franklin. In fact, he was the governor of Franklin. So he and Tipton did not like each other at all. In fact, there was a battle of Franklin between the Tiptonites and the Franklinites. It's like 60 guys in a barroom brawl, but they call it the Battle of Franklin. Tipton also opposed ratification of the Constitution. He was a member of the convention in North Carolina to ratify, and he voted no. Sevier was for the Constitution, so I guess they just hated each other. Sevier went on to be not just governor of Franklin County, but also a member of the first U.S. Congress for one term, because his district disappeared when that part of North Carolina became Tennessee. Then he became the first governor of Tennessee for, I think, 3 terms, and then served 3 terms in Congress and died in office. And there is a statue of him in the U.S. Capitol. And I used to work there, and when I was giving people tours, I would say, it says here he was the governor of Franklin. What's that mean? People never knew. John Sevier and Andrew Jackson also didn't get along. In fact, Andrew Jackson challenged Sevier to a duel. And here's the letter challenging him, right? Your attack was in the town of Knoxville. In the town of Knoxville, you did take the name of a lady into your polluted lips. In the town of Knoxville, did you challenge me to draw where you were armed with a cutlass and I with just a cane? And now, sir, in the neighborhood of Knoxville, you shall atone for it, or I will publish you as a coward and a poltroon. This is the future president of the United States talking here, right? So that's fun stuff. Abraham Bowman lived to 1837. I have a theory that he was the longest surviving Continental Army colonel. That's pretty late for a fairly senior officer to live. He is buried outside of Lexington. And here are some graves of Dunmore or Shenandoah County veterans. I'll just zip through them. John Breeding was in Jonathan Clark's company. He was one of the ones who deserted, but in August, I think probably because he was really sick, but who knows. He later served in the Illinois Regiment with George Rogers Clark. He's buried in Missouri. Abraham Burner was in Richard Campbell's company. He was left sick in Virginia in 1777 and dropped from the rolls. He probably came back from Georgia sick with malaria and just could not serve anymore. There were a bunch of those guys. He's buried in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Adam Cabbage was in Clark's company. He served all the way, his full 2 years, was discharged at Valley Forge. He's buried in Tennessee. William Eagle was in what was Steed's company. This was originally Richard Campbell's company. He enlisted late in 1777, and he's buried a really pretty spot just opposite Seneca Rocks in Pendleton County, West Virginia. Philip Easton was actually from Frederick County, but he was promoted from being an enlisted guy to be one of Clark's junior officers. He's buried in Indiana. The one on the left here, Philip Fine, there were 3 Fine brothers from Shenandoah County. They all moved west. Philip was the first American to live in St. Louis, Missouri, 20 years before the Louisiana Purchase. And then he ran a ferry across a river south of St. Louis, and his descendants, after doing some detective work, found his grave under the soil about 4 years ago, just in perfect condition. I think it just fell over 150 years ago and has just been there ever since. So that's it on the left. Joseph Galladay, a local guy here, some of you might remember him, had that stone put up for his ancestor a few years ago. Jacob Sibley moved to Tennessee and then to Alabama. That gravestone is in Huntsville. John Breeding, I'm going backwards. Christopher Young is buried in Chillicothe, Ohio. Joseph Parrott is another guy from Clark's company who was buried in Ohio. Leonard Cooper. I told you about Leonard Cooper. He's the guy who was in the duel, lost his leg. So he moved back home. He lived somewhere near Front Royal. And he only had one leg. He trained his horse to kneel so he could climb on. And his favorite thing to do was to go into Front Royal once a month for court day. In colonial times, court day, when the county court met, that was the big social event. That's when the militia mustered, and that's when everybody saw each other and caught up on gossip. He loved to go in for that, and he would ride in on his horse. I forget the date of his death, but he was riding home from court day, and his horse stumbled in the Shenandoah. He fell off, couldn't get back on, couldn't get out of the river, and drowned. They pulled his body out of the river. That's not the end of the injustice. There was another Leonard Cooper who lived out near Point Pleasant in West Virginia, halfway down the Ohio River. Somebody at some point did some sloppy genealogical research and said, hey, Leonard Cooper was an officer in the Continental Army. I'm going to get a headstone for him from the VA. And there it is, out in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, on the wrong guy's grave. Now, you all are from the right county, and you guys should be furious right now. I think you should get on a bus and go out there and just yank the thing out of the ground and bring it home. But that is the wrong Leonard Cooper. Who knows where he's buried, actually, but it'd be nice to remember him here. The other guy is Daniel Cloud, who was in Richard Campbell's company, and he's buried in Prospect Hill Cemetery in Front Royal. It's very, very weather beaten, but one of only a few original gravestones that survive. Here's Jonathan Clark's grave in Louisville. He's buried right next to his younger brother, George Rogers Clark, the general, his wife, and some other brothers. William Clark, the really famous one, is buried in Missouri. And that big thing in the back is sort of the Clark family memorial. Not everybody moved away, though. This is the house of George Clower, who was a private soldier in Captain Clark's company. I took that picture about an hour and a half ago. That's in Woodstock. And according to the National Register of Historic Places paperwork from Woodstock for the historic downtown, I think they say probably or believed to be or traditionally known as, this is George Clower's house. He lived in it until 1822. Jacob Rinker, who I told you about, this is his grave out near Connickville. It is just a really, really pretty spot. Picture doesn't really do it justice. He was also, like John Tipton, a delegate to the ratification convention for the U.S. Constitution, but here in Virginia, and he voted yes, so he's one of the good guys. Rinker rode into Woodstock from Connickville in 1827 to visit a fellow veteran, Joachim Fetzer. Are there any Fetzers around here anymore? No Fetzers? Both of them were Swiss, and they'd both been in Jonathan Clark's company. Fetzer was dying, and Rinker wanted to visit him. But it was the middle of January, and it was raining. He caught cold, couldn't go home. Fetzer died. Rinker died the next day, both in Woodstock. Fetzer is believed to be buried at the Lutheran Church in Woodstock. Here, last two graves, Jacob Parrott is on the left. That is down in Rockingham County, Singer's Glen. It's illegible unless you turn the stone just to the right angle in the sunlight. And it's broken. It's laying flat on the ground. John Bly, he's buried in west part of the county as well, on private property. He's one of the guys. Is anybody here related to him? You? He's one of the guys who deserted and got caught and had to go back. But he had a reason, right? They didn't sign up to go to South Carolina, right? So he's buried here too. So I am just about done. I just want to say a few more words about Richard Campbell. So unlike most of these guys who moved away or moved here from Caroline County or somewhere else, he was from here. He was raised here probably. He was a deputy sheriff. He enlisted here. He was involved in local affairs here, served through the war until he died at Utah Springs, which makes him unique, right? Peter Muhlenberg was only here for 4 or 5 years. So he died, whatever it is, 350 miles away. There is no monument for him, no marker. They don't even know where his grave is. They just dug a hole and threw him in before they got out of Dodge. And there's also no marker here. There ought to be one somewhere, don't you think, guys? I think it would be real nice if somehow he could be remembered here. He was a lieutenant colonel and the second highest ranking battlefield casualty from Virginia. This is the Utah Springs battlefield. It's just a little state park. There's very little in it. That's actually the grave of a British officer who died there. There is a DAR memorial, a random grave from the 1840s, and a little state historic marker. That's it. Nothing about Richard Campbell here or there. This is an 1845 engraving of the battlefield. See that guy, the dead body on the ground there, wearing a boot? The boot suggests an officer, right? Because he's riding a horse. I don't know that it's intentional, but I take that to be Richard Campbell laying on the ground there. So I'm putting it there to make you all feel guilty so that you'll think of a way to honor Richard Campbell here in his home. And I was going to click to my last slide, but I'd rather you looked at Richard Campbell. Well, it's too late. I already clicked through it. I'm done. And I'm sorry I went over.
And by the way, there's several DAR members here, and they may take on that challenge.
Oh, fantastic. Who has questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks for doing this work.
Sure.
And I'm cheering you on your book. I can't help but write any of it. Do you have a estimated publication date? Or you hope to?
The manuscript is due in April next year.
Ooh, okay.
So I have a publisher, and they're drumming their fingers. So
Most of your the resources you found are like everywhere, Library of Virginia?
all over,
Okay.
yeah. Some surprising places too, like the county histories from rural Ohio, where there's just like a little memory about a veteran, right?
Oh, you're a very good detective then. Thank you.
I call it that. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle with a million little pieces. So, who else? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any list of the little guys, the ones who weren't officers?
I do. Yep. If you look on my website, I have some of them listed there. But if you want the full list, you're going to have to buy the book. Exactly. Who else has a question?
I've got one.
Yes.
I know a lot, as far as moving west, a lot of them went there because they were given land for their time in the service. Can you talk a little bit about how much land was actually given out to these soldiers?
Yeah, I don't think I can remember the numbers of acres, but I think like a private would get 100 acres. Generals got like many thousands of acres, right? And they would trade. And the way I would love to tell the full story, but I'll just give you a short version. Virginia gave the land because the entire frontier belonged to Virginia, right? In fact, North America was Virginia in 1607, right? We was robbed. I heard that. Yeah, it's true. Repeatedly. So in 1779, when they were having trouble recruiting, the Virginia House of Delegates enacted a statute saying, okay, we're going to give everybody land after the war if you'll enlist. In 1783, they appointed commissioners to be in charge of it. They were all officers. Peter Muhlenberg was one of them, as was George Rogers Clark. And there were two groups, right? There were the Continental soldiers and there were the state soldiers, right? Or what had in colonial times been provincial soldiers. So Muhlenberg was in charge of the Continental land, and George Rogers Clark with some other guys, the state land. That's more detailed than you needed. But they had if you wanted the very best land, you had to go out to Louisville on a certain day in 1784 for a lottery. So you had all these guys going through the Cumberland Gap and down the river from Pittsburgh for this lottery. And Peter Muhlenberg was basically in charge of the whole thing, and he kept a diary. The way he got there was going down the river. They had the lottery, but it didn't go very well, and nobody wanted to go out and do the surveying because it was dangerous, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. But they got the first pieces done. Peter Muhlenberg, on his way home through the Cumberland Gap, it's very dangerous, the Indian attacks. He sees like 5 or 6 dead bodies just on the side of the road as he's coming home. It's crazy stuff, but that's a long answer. Muhlenberg got land along the Scioto River in Ohio, and he traded, I think, with another officer for land in Kentucky. Muhlenberg's youngest son actually got a piece of the land in Ohio, and there's a Muhlenberg Township in Ohio named after Peter Muhlenberg's son. Careful with the questions, I tend to give long answers. Anybody else have a question? That's it? Okay, yep, no, that's great.